Хайырлы күн. Уважаемые коллеги, прошу занять свои места, мы сейчас начнем. Dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Yernar. I'm a member of the advisory board of the Astana Civil Service Hub. It's a pleasure and a particular privilege for me to facilitate a couple of sessions in this afternoon. I'm very glad and happy to see many old friends and new friends here of the hub. I met and worked closely with them, with many of you during my previous capacity in the Astana hub. So pleasure to be here. The first session is about strategic human resource management, and there is a difference between strategic human resource management and the human resource management. Why strategic is because it includes long-term objectives of attracting and retaining talent, grooming the next generation of leaders in the civil service. Now, there is, as you know, a growing, very fruitful cooperation between the Astana Civil Service Hub and the OECD. And one of the fruits of this partnership is the survey that Daniel will, I think, elaborate on extensively. So, of course, a lot has been done in Kazakhstan in terms of the civil service reform from 1995 with attempts to get the basics right, and through to more sophisticated reforms of 2011-2018 with introduction of senior executive service, new compensation scheme, leadership training, and motivation and competency frameworks. The issue of motivation is of particular issue and importance because of course we also distinguish between the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and the Astana Hub completed a research paper on what motivates civil servants in Kazakhstan and Pakistan, and I think the handouts or the printouts of this paper are there available for you to pick up. And of course, increasingly in Kazakhstan, I think and elsewhere in the world, we see that the civil servants, especially the younger generation, are motivated not only by monetary compensation, but also by intrinsic motivation, by the way they are treated, by the way they are empowered, by the way they are able to deliver the changes they aspire to do. So with the notion of known unknowns, the Kazakh government recognizes that there is much more to be done in professionalizing the civil service to match the OECD standards. So in that sense, we are happy to have Daniel to elaborate with more details on what is happening, what was happening in Kazakhstan in terms of strategically managing the human resources in the civil service, and what has been done so far, what has gone successful, but also what is there that should be done in the future. So please, Daniel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yernar didn't mention, but when we started this project, he was working in the hub, and he was very much a driver behind this project. And so thank you for being a great partner to get this moving. Thanks to the hub for continuing to move it once Yernar went his own way. A huge thank you to the Agency for Civil Service and Anti-Corruption, because all of the information really comes from them. And I know that it was a lot of work pulling together all of the answers to the many questions that we asked. We were on the phone very often, and so this is a huge effort on their part, and with lots of success behind it. Perhaps a quick background. I'm going to talk for around 30 minutes or so, and give you sort of the summary of this rather extensive report. And then we can open it up to some questions and debate. But let me give you a little bit of background around some of the work, where this comes from, and the survey itself. I run a program of work at the OECD on public employment and management. And so this is looking at people management in government. We look at all sorts of areas, including strategic human resource management. And this the core of the work is driven by what we call our Public Employment and Management Working Party, which is essentially a committee of delegates from all of the OECD member countries who come together once or twice a year to share ideas, to discuss challenges and common approaches, and to develop work together. This working party has existed for many years, and this year we're really moving the yardstick forward in this area because we are working on the first OECD recommendation on public employment and management. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of my presentation because it aligns quite nicely with many of the themes that come up in the work that we've done here with Kazakhstan. I'd also like to just set the scene a little bit by reflecting a bit on the theme of this event, on public service for SDG implementation. And we've heard a lot also about the challenges of technology and of digitalization and the changing nature of work moving forward into the future. And I'm really, really happy to be invited here in the context of this theme to talk about human resource management because in many cases, HRM is sometimes forgotten in these discussions. People love to talk about new technology, they love to talk about new strategies, but they often forget that nothing will happen without getting the right people in the right places to put these new technologies in place and to make sure that they're actually used effectively. And we can look around the world at countless numbers of opportunities that have been missed, countless dollars, euros that have been spent to put in new systems, invest in technology, that come up with really disappointing results, and often this is because the people aren't ready for them. We have many networks of different public sector specialists, including one that is the chief information officers, the CIOs, the people who are driving often this digital transformation in the public sector. And when we talk to them, they tell us very clearly, very often, for us it's not a challenge of technology. The technology exists. It's the challenge of figuring out how we can adapt our people to use this technology effectively. It's a challenge of human resource management. It's a challenge of leadership. And so these kinds of topics, HRM, leadership, in the context of digital transformation, in the context of implementing very difficult, complex challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals, are fundamental and absolutely important that we don't lose sight of this fundamental issue. I mean, just to give you a small snapshot, there was, at our recent meeting of the Public Employment and Management Working Party, our delegate from the United States told us that they had done some internal research about the replacement rates of different professions inside the government and how automation will probably transform, she said, at least 40% of jobs. At least 40% of the people working in the administration will no longer be needed. And the other 60%, their work will change fundamentally. So I think it's very important that we not lose sight of these issues as we talk about digitization, because it's not something that's going to happen only in the ICT department. It's something that will impact every single one of us working anywhere in the public administration. So with that in mind, let me turn to the work that we have done with Kazakhstan. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of this research. I'll present some of the main chapters and key findings and talk about some of the main messages and considerations for the future, and then we'll end with some discussion from you. Perhaps to begin with, we've been thinking about the way that we can talk about different aspects of public administration and of civil service reform under three categories. The first and the most fundamental is that we need to ensure that we have a professional civil service. This means a civil service of people who are well qualified, who are technical, but who also understand the politics. So it's not enough just to take a bunch of super qualified people, technical experts, and put them into a government. There needs to be some kind of political awareness and some interface between those two. And we can think about that type of civil servants who are qualified, ethical, driven by the right values, and have enough independence and balance. We can think about the kinds of civil service management that requires, being merit-based, transparent, trusted. And we can think about the kind of leadership that is required in a civil service, which has this as the fundamental. But is that enough? Is it enough just to take a lot of very qualified people and say that your civil service is finished? Well, we also need to think about the strategic orientation of that civil service. How is it driven by outcomes? How can it be evidence-based, future-oriented, proactive, and networked? Right? This is really looking at the future and thinking, how do we organize ourselves to achieve the right future for our citizens? And often, governments, regardless of their level of development, are finding that they're limited in actually being able to achieve these objectives through the systems that are currently in place, and they need to go one step further. They need to think about how their public administrations can be innovative. Innovation in the public administration is not something that has been talked about greatly until the last few years, where there has now been a huge call and a rally for understanding innovation in a public sector context in order to achieve objectives like the Sustainable Development Goals. And here we're really looking at many of the issues around intrinsic motivation that Yernar brought up in his introduction. We're looking at how civil servants can be empowered to do things in iterative ways, to learn from their, in each step, to ask the right questions and to be change makers. We're looking at how these structures can be more open and collaborative, how diversity can play a stronger role in driving innovation. And leadership then needs to be more collaborative and adaptive. With that in mind, we developed a survey, not exactly designed to test these three areas, but it helps us to think about how each of these different elements fit. And the SHRM survey itself has been around for some time. It was first run, I believe, in 2006, well before my time at the OECD. It was then rerun in 2010, and then most recently in 2016 with a bit of updating. In 2016, we got answers from all OECD member countries, 35 members at that time. And we then began discussions with Chairman Baimanov and with Yernar to see how we could use that survey as well to look at how Kazakhstan compares to the OECD countries. I'm also really proud to say that we're now using this survey in the Southeast Asian Government at a Glance, which I mentioned earlier, so that will extend this data set to all ASEAN countries. And we're using it in the next edition of the Latin American Government at a Glance. So it's really actually starting to have a more global reach beyond the 35 member countries of the OECD. And it looks at quite a wide variety of HR management tools and mechanisms in use in central public administrations. The focus is not on the local level or on the subnational level, it's on the central level. In some countries, those are combined. In many of the OECD countries, they're quite separate. The report itself is structured in 4 main sections. The first looks at the structure and management globally of the civil service. Then we take a look at competencies, how competency management is supported through the life cycle of civil servants. We look at how performance is assessed and managed, and then we look at leadership, how leadership is able to bring it all together and motivate through a culture of performance. So I'll go through each one of these and give you a few of the statistics, but there's much, much more in the report. As well in the report, we have many different examples of other countries and how they're approaching some of these topics. Again, I think it's important to mention that there is no one way of addressing these issues. We do not see one common best practice HRM. It totally depends on where the countries are starting, what their issues are, what their cultures are, and how their traditions have developed. So the idea is not to necessarily rank Kazakhstan against OECD member countries, but more to give it a sense of where it positions and to inspire with some examples and possibilities for the next steps in its reform. Starting with the first chapter, we look at the size and shape of the civil service, the institutional authorities and the delegation of human resource management, strategic vision, and HR data. You can see that there's quite a wide variety of sizes when it comes to the public sector. Public employment could count for as much as 30% of total employment in Norway and as little as just over 6% in Japan. And Kazakhstan is around 20%, which puts it in the range of Latvia, Slovakia, Israel, just a little bit less than France, and significantly more than the two Asian countries in this list in Korea and Japan. This is, again, not to say that one is too many or too little, but to give an overall sense of global public employment. We look at the share of women, for example, as well. And we know that, as in most OECD countries, women are overrepresented in the broad public sector. And in Kazakhstan, that's around 60%, which is just above the OECD average of about 58%. In central government, Kazakhstan has slightly fewer women, at 53% of women in total. But as with most OECD countries, we see that number significantly decline as we go up the hierarchy. And so we only see 26% of women or so in senior positions, and about 15% of them in the core A. We know that there's a target of 30% in Kazakhstan for senior decision making, which is commendable. There's a 40% target in France and a 50% target in some other countries. We look at the delegation of human resource management, and this is helpful because it helps us to think about how centralized the function is or how delegated it is. In countries like Slovakia and Sweden, HRM is really run by each individual ministry and agency with a few common guidelines. In countries like Luxembourg and Greece, it's very much centralized. Almost everything is done by one central agency. And you can see that in Kazakhstan, it's relatively centralized as well. More centralized than the majority of OECD countries. And this is helpful to make sure that we're developing common standards, common frameworks, but it adds a challenge to see how those common standards and frameworks can be applied to agencies which might have very different business needs and business operations. And so in a very centralized system, there is a challenge to make sure that the tools, the methods, the approaches that are being developed by the center are adaptable and effective to actually meet the needs of the agencies that are designing and delivering services on behalf of the government. We also look at government-wide civil service strategies, because certainly strategic HRM needs to begin with a strategic vision of where the civil service should be. What should it be doing? What is this hope for the future? And there, Kazakhstan has a lot to build on. There are a range of strategies and visions which the president has elaborated all the way up to 2050. And we're very happy to recognize that civil service capacity, capability, independence is part of this strategic vision. That's really important. It's not always the case. There are many governments which elaborate strategic visions and use the civil service as an afterthought, if anything. So this is a very strong starting point. and one which we're very pleased to see. To further build on good, effective strategic management, we need good understanding of data, of what the civil service looks like and how it's functioning. And here we've developed a range of questions and analysis around the collection of administrative data. And you can see here that Kazakhstan actually collects slightly more than the average OECD countries, and that's also a point of strength. And this is also one of the advantages of being a relatively centralized operation, is that it's easier to standardize data across different agencies and ministries, collect it, and use it for strategic planning. But the question then remains, how is the data used? And this is a question that has come up often across OECD countries. We see a huge amount of data being collected now in all sorts of government operations, and still mostly going unused. The full potential of it is not being actually leveraged for strategic decision making. So in this survey, we asked whether the data is used for reporting. Yes, it's used to reporting to the public, it's used for reporting to the politicians, it's used for reporting to the senior civil service. But some countries have taken this further. They've really created online portals that enable decision makers to access data in real time, to compare themselves and benchmark themselves with different agencies and ministries that are facing similar challenges, and then this allows them to actually react and respond very quickly. And this is perhaps something that's not yet being used to its full potential in Kazakhstan. The other question is around workforce planning, because it's nice to have a strategic vision, it's nice to have a lot of data. Are we using this data to actually inform regular plans that allow us to look at the changing nature of the work, the skills and types of people that are required, the numbers of them, and how we can begin to transform this? I mean, this is essential for any kind of digital transformation, recognizing that just hiring the same people because one left isn't going to create a transformation. There needs to be a rethinking of what skills are required, what skills are no longer required, and how do we transition from point A to point B. And at this stage, there is no common framework for doing that work in Kazakhstan, as is the case in many OECD countries, although most have developed some common framework, and so perhaps this is something to put on the agenda of the next phase of reforms in Kazakhstan. So as we look at the key messages and considerations from this particular chapter, we've identified that a centralized HRM makes common HR systems easier to design and implement, that there's a clear and ambitious civil service reform vision, that there's a good amount of data. So the challenge is, how can we bring together the data to address more workforce planning, more strategic workforce planning to achieve these visions. The second part of the report looks at the use of competencies and competency management. Here we are looking at the classification of skills and competencies. We're looking at recruitment methods to bring in those skills and competencies. We're looking at learning and development so that people are actually learning the right skills and competencies as they go through their career. And mobility and promotion. Are those skills and competencies being aligned to as people move upwards in their careers? We recently launched a report called Skills for a High-Performing Civil Service, where we put out a skills model that we think can help civil services to ask the right questions about which skills and competencies are required. And I won't spend too much time on that, but essentially we've looked at 4 key areas that are required to really drive impact in the civil service. We've looked at how the civil service can better inform policy development, working with elected officials, how the civil service can deliver better services to citizens using all sorts of new skills and tools for service design, but also for bringing the citizens into the service and design and policy decision-making process. We've also recognized that increasingly in OECD countries, services are delivered through third-party agencies and organizations, through very complex service delivery arrangements, contracting mechanisms, commissioning processes. And so this is a whole skill set in and of itself which is often undervalued in public administrations. And the fourth area that we've looked at is around collaborating through networks. How do civil servants work in partnership with other organizations, or with each other even across their own silos to deliver things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which can never be delivered by one agency, ministry alone. Kazakhstan has taken recent steps to develop a common competency framework across its public administration and across its senior level civil servants. And this is good news. It puts it squarely into the right framework to begin doing competency management, to be looking at the skills and capabilities of civil servants to drive change. We asked which competencies tend to be promoted. And again, you can see a lot of alignment. The green on here are the choices that Kazakhstan told us are emphasized in their competency framework. The length of the line shows you how many other OECD countries emphasize those in their own competency frameworks. So you can see that the most common top 5 are all included in Kazakhstan's framework. Essentially, we're looking for civil servants who have a strong sense of values and ethics, who are able to be leaders, who are focused on achieving results, who are able to think strategically, and who are able to be strong communicators. We're also looking at interpersonal relationships, being able to take initiative, et cetera, et cetera. You can see the rest of the list. The question that I like to raise with this slide is that we see often many of the competencies which are perhaps most valued today around digitization, around understanding the political landscape, around negotiation, innovation. These are on the lower end of the spectrum, and again, they're also not included in Kazakhstan. And so we're pushing our countries, we're pushing OECD countries to begin investing more in these areas, because these are the areas that the future requires, and that will be core to achieving many of the results that we have already talked about this morning. We look at recruitment systems. How are recruitment systems aligned to bring skills in? And this chart, again, it's absolutely not a normative chart. This is not meant to suggest that one country is better than the other. This is a chart looking at two very different approaches, two different systems. On the one hand, we have systems that are career-based. On the other hand, we have systems that are more position-oriented. The career-based systems, people join the civil service. They often stay for their whole careers. They tend to enter when they're quite young. They stay in the career civil service until they're quite old. They retire. They work up the system. To be a senior manager, you need to have entered at the bottom. The position-based systems, which is more maybe a Scandinavian model, a Northern European model, each position is open to external recruitment. Anybody can apply, and there tends to be much more individuality in the system. Kazakhstan's system is more to the career side, but it uses aspects of the position system as well. It's not as careerish as the Southern European countries you can see on the chart. And this is helpful when thinking about learning systems, because in career civil services, there's a lot of effort that needs to be put into training and development, because you have young people who join you, but who will stay for a very long time. How do we make sure that people are developed as they move through? Well, we've looked at 3 different models. One is looking at the individual. So It's up to the individual to figure out how they want to learn, and they are given a responsibility to go and find learning opportunities. They often have individual learning plans. Sometimes it's up to the individual organization to structure organizational development plans that will support their employees. And rarely we actually see civil service-wide training and development strategies. But sometimes we see these all combined. So in Kazakhstan, we see that there are civil service-wide plans and organizational plans. We don't see individual learning plans. In a number of countries, they've combined all three of these. The UK, Poland, Korea, France, Hungary, Switzerland have actually taken all three of these elements and put them together to create an alignment across so that individuals understand that it's their responsibility to learn, that organizations are able to plan for that learning, and that it lines up with some sort of strategic, coherent vision of the future. We look at the current priorities in training and development. In the OECD countries, it tends to be focusing on executive leadership training and coaching, as well as online course development. Second level priority is training for middle management. And we're happy to see that Kazakhstan is investing in all three of these areas. In the report, we give a lot of examples also of different ways that, of coaching and experiential learning that can be used to support better leadership. I think it's also very important, as we reflect on sustainable development goals, to ask ourselves how training, learning, development, and these kinds of platforms can be created to ensure that we're cross-fertilizing ideas, because we know that the SDGs will only be achieved if we're able to actually bring these different perspectives of different institutions together. And this might require a different kind of learning and development tool, one that's more about sharing, one that's more about creating a common platform. And in fact, we'll be hosting a meeting of our Global Schools of Government Network in Helsinki in September to explore exactly these issues. What kind of role for schools of administration in achieving sustainable development goals? And again, the idea of having a learning culture is absolutely central to everything that we've talked about. One thing we can be sure of, the future is very murky, but we know that it's going to happen rapidly. And that whatever skills we hire for today, especially in a career-based civil service, will be changing in 5 years. Even next year, we may rediscover a new technology and we need new skills. And when we have a career civil service, we have to train and develop those. However, you can see here that training and development perhaps is not as prioritized at the moment in Kazakhstan as in some of the other countries. Globally, there has been a reduction in training and development budgets in civil services. And this is perhaps worrying. On the other hand, training and development, training days are not a perfect measure of a learning culture either. And in fact, if we're only counting on training days as the driver of a learning culture, we're perhaps sadly investing in the wrong areas. It is one answer to a much more difficult question. But that said, our understanding is that in Kazakhstan, mandatory training is once every 3 years, and sometimes it's used as a remedy for low performance. The risk is that training becomes seen as something negative, something that you have to go and do because you didn't perform well enough. When in fact, it should be the opposite. It should be something that is driving people's forward aspirations and everybody's forward vision for the way that they want to be moving, both in their careers and their organizations. So to summarize this chapter, we've talked about Kazakhstan beginning to put in many of the components for proper competency management. But aligning planning, recruitment, development, and performance competency management is a complex issue. And so we need to think about how we can focus on skills and competencies for the future and integrate those into all of the aspects of people management. And that is a very ambitious goal. It's one that no country is doing perfectly, but that most are striving towards. The next chapter looks at performance pay systems, and working conditions. And I know that this will be partly the topic of the next session, so perhaps I'll seed a few ideas and provoke a little and see if it's picked up in the next group. We have a composite indicator looking at the use of performance assessment. And in this one, actually, we looked at two aspects of Kazakhstan. The first is today, or perhaps a few weeks ago, when the answers were provided to us. And the little triangle there is where we expect them to be when the current reforms are implemented fully. And so you can see there's a bit of a gap. So the use and the second chart that we've looked at in this section is looking at the use of performance-related pay. Performance pay, I will tell you, is not a necessary ingredient of a high-performing civil service. It can be used effectively, but very carefully, and in very specific situations. But generally, if you look at the broad data, if you look at most research on the topic, particularly in the public sector, there are big questions as to whether performance-related pay really makes any kind of difference, or perhaps maybe actually hurts in a negative way. And part of the challenge is thinking about what individual performance can be measured when you're talking about such complex challenges like Sustainable Development Goals. How do we know that we're rewarding the right behavior? How do we know that we're not discouraging other kinds of creative thinking? There's no easy answers. We're also not advocating for a seniority-based approach, where everybody just gets more money the longer they stay in their position. That doesn't help anything either. So it's a challenge of trying to figure out the best way to align performance, pay, complexity, achievement. But the idea of having an achievement focus is not going to be resolved by a pay system. It's going to require a much more careful approach to management. One of those can be used through employee surveys, because we can actually measure motivation, engagement, and different aspects of value orientation through well-designed surveys. And in some countries, they use these as effective tools to really continuously manage their civil service and identify key management challenges and opportunities. And what they're seeing is that very often, people's motivation is not correlated to their perceptions of their pay. In many surveys that ask about the two of them, we don't see a link. Of course, if people are very badly paid, that's going to have all sorts of negative repercussions. But if people are sort of moving from that, I'm comfortable, to I have a bit more money, we don't see a huge amount of impact. So in this part of the report, we look at how the use of employee surveys can be structured to actually look at those internal motivation, those intrinsic motivation factors, and what can that tell us in terms of motivation and of the leadership and management capabilities to motivate their employees. And in that sense, Kazakhstan has some infrastructure in place, but we don't see them using these kind of surveys to the degree that some of the leading OECD countries are doing to really understand and drive performance in their workforce. And I think that's the key consideration. There's a lot of work going on in performance. Really what it comes down to is you can have a performance system, you can have pay, you can have surveys, but you need the managers to make it work. And the management quality is the only thing in the end that will really drive good performance, or that will stop all of your other systems from working towards good performance. Which takes us into the last chapter on building leadership. And here we see that Kazakhstan has made huge progress and huge investments in developing the Core A. And this is a big achievement, one that really pushes Kazakhstan forward and makes it clear that they are taking the idea of leadership very seriously. I just came back actually from a mission in Brazil where we're working on leadership issues. And Brazil is a bit the opposite, right? Brazil has no structured leadership system in their civil service. And we're working with them right now to try and think about what steps they can take. But to me, it was a stark contrast working there because without a strong leadership, the entire civil service gets lost. And in a situation right now, which Brazil is facing, where they have a very challenging political situation on their hands, very little public service leadership, the entire civil service is sitting there and they don't know how to react. They don't know how to move forward. So having a core A is a huge and important step to take. This chart looks at the amount of difference between the leadership and the regular HR systems for people. And you can see that even with the core A, Kazakhstan is around the average. So there is space for to develop further the core A management structures. We see that when we're talking about competencies for senior civil servants, people management, strategic thinking, values and ethics, communication and action management are very much prioritized. Perhaps there's an opportunity to think about change management, since that's really the theme of much of today. I'm trying to speed up because I'm taking a little bit longer. The employment frameworks for senior managers, we also see in Kazakhstan that there's a lot of emphasis put into the management of their performance, that they're recruited with a more centralized process, and that there's a lot of emphasis into shorter-term recruitments. And talking about performance management, in most OECD countries, there's quite a separate performance system, and that's actually where we see much of the performance-related pay in OECD countries being focused on, is that senior level, less so on the regular core of civil servants. We see more of an approach towards a dismissal for bad performance, performance agreements with ministers, fixed-term contracts, and these are also part of the Kazakh system. So we think there's a lot of good frameworks to build on there. One area, though, that perhaps we need to think about particularly in the scope of these strategic or the sustainable development goals is how do we motivate and hold senior civil servants accountable for achieving results that aren't just in their vertical silos? There are some countries which have incorporated that into the performance agreements of their senior management, that are incorporated into the management systems, and in some cases their bonuses are required. They have to show how they have actually achieved results outside of their own jurisdiction. And that's not being done yet in Kazakhstan. Perhaps there's opportunity to explore some of that. So again, key messages and considerations for this last chapter. We see that there's been a lot of effort into the development of senior leadership. We think that there could be perhaps more effort to build that pipeline through the system to identify high-performing public employees and to train them, to develop them to be future senior leaders. And then looking at how to link talent management and various different elements to ensure that that accountability is well aligned with the challenges that Kazakhstan is facing now and into the future. So, in conclusion, we heard a lot about digital transformations. The question now is, how can Kazakhstan use these different HR tools that have been developed that very much appear to be putting it on a path towards achieving many of the at least addressing many of the same challenges as OECD countries are facing. But how can those tools really be used to transform organizations, to change the way the work is being done, and not just as another sort of step that has to be accomplished, not just as another burden that's being placed onto organizations. We think that there's work to be done on focusing on continuously identifying and building the right skills and competencies in the workforce, to ensure that leadership and senior civil service keep pace with all of the changing environment and changing demands, and to build and sustain a real performance culture in Kazakhstan's civil service. Now, I began with this framework, professional, strategic, and innovative. And if we look at a lot of the steps that Kazakhstan has taken, what we see is that something that sort of looks like this. So there's been a lot of effort in developing a professional civil service and professionalizing the tools and systems of the civil service. So we think at this point that there needs to be some effort to make sure that those are consolidated, that they're effectively used by all of the different agencies and ministries who need to use them, but also that they remain updated and that they don't become too rigid. In terms of the strategic areas, we think there's room to continue developing some of the things, particularly in the realms of strategic planning. And in innovation, it's time to start exploring some of the different tools and methods that can be used to enable civil servants, to give them the kind of autonomy and space to try things, to, we heard earlier, to fail, to take risks in controlled environments. One last word on where we're taking all of this work at the OECD next. I mentioned at the beginning that we're now working on developing the first international instrument on a public service leadership and capability. This will be an OECD recommendation. It will be a framework, a normative framework that we can use to understand and assess advances in civil service reform and civil service leadership across OECD countries. It's a long process, but we have a very good, we had very good discussions at the most recent Public Employment and Management Working Party, where we discussed a draft. We will be putting the next draft of this recommendation online in the next weeks for an open consultation around the world. And so I very much hope that the Hub will share that link with its members, with its participating countries, so that we can make sure that we get as much input into the content of this recommendation as we can, because this will be really one of the first international standards of what good people management in central governments could and should look like to face all of the challenges that we've been discussing today. And it will help us, it will guide us in the work that we do at the OECD around all of these themes. Right now it's based on 3 core pillars. One is looking at the values-driven culture and leadership. So how do we define the values of the public service? How do we build leaders with the right capabilities? How do we make sure that we're being inclusive and forward-looking? The second is looking at more of the core HRM to build a capable and trusted civil service, the professionalization, the competency management. The last is looking at how to make sure that our civil service structures, as I said, aren't too rigid, that they're agile, that they're responsive, that they can adapt to changing circumstances. There we're looking at the institutions, the planning, the mobility, the terms and conditions of employment, and the way that employees can express their voice in the system. So I'll leave you with that, and again, I really want to thank the Hub and the agency for this collaboration, and I'm happy to take any questions with the few minutes that we have remaining. Thank you.
Агентство по делам государственной службы, противодействия коррупции, представители вот Айгерим Асиль сидят. Тоже, коллеги, если у вас есть вопросы конкретно по презентации, конкретно по этому вопросу, пожалуйста, вы можете сейчас задать. И также я хотел отметить, что в рамках этой сессии вопросов и ответов и следующей сессии у нас достаточно времени для ваших вопросов, для ваших комментариев. Я знаю, что до обеда у вас были комментарии, вы можете задать их сейчас и на следующей сессии. Пожалуйста, вопросы по данной презентации. Пожалуйста. Вы можете использовать микрофоны в зале. Если можно, представиться.
Thank you very much. I'm Vachik Kirakosan from Armenia. I'm from the e-governance infrastructure implementation unit, but formerly I was also a public servant. So know very well what you were talking about. Now, the thing is that the concept of comparing or benchmarking the performance of civil servants against the OECD countries is very interesting, and it gives a pretty good framework of growth. But I would say that not less interesting, maybe even more interesting, would be a comparison of their performance against the private sector employees in their own countries. And my question is whether, whether there was an attempt like that, and do you have any ideas on that sense? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's a difficult one, to be honest. I think there are ways of benchmarking some aspects of employees' activities with private sector organizations. I think I've seen it most clearly done in employee surveys, where you'll have data sets from private sector organizations which could be, or surveys which could be replicated in public sector organizations, and you can use some of that to compare. But there we're looking more at perceptions. I mean, it's a challenge because, you know, as I said this morning, the private sector has a different set of obligations, and it has a different way of driving performance. Now, we can debate and argue whether there's really a big difference in who is a civil servant and who is a private employee. There is certainly different standards, though, that we hold them to account for. We expect private sector employees to treat us courteously. We expect them to deliver services, but we expect them to be profitable. So we tend not to be too upset when they price things very high and don't make services accessible to poor people, for example. The public sector has no ability to do that. We don't expect them to do that. However, we do expect them to deliver services on par with the private sector. So there are, and I just use that as one small example, in ways that it becomes very difficult to develop the right kind of comparisons between public and private, because so many of the sort of baseline fundamental operating models are different. Now, if we take issues that are much more technical in nature, like, you know, maybe IT, even there we end up in a very different scenario, because in my experience, most public sector organizations are not willing to invest nearly enough in IT. They want a system, but they don't quite understand the requirements of maintaining that system, of having the staff that are constantly updating their skills and their abilities to maintain those systems. And so what we often see are legacy systems and staff who are trained in very old approaches to things, who are continued in that same way. So again, the difference is that in a public sector, all of those investments need to be done with public money. We quickly find ourselves in a political situation where internal technical aspects are not considered very sexy. Politicians want to invest money in things that have a high level of visibility, versus the private sector, where technology can be the core operational model, right? Now, maybe the public sector needs to become that, but there are huge barriers in the way. And again, the political nature of what happens in the public sector, the responsibility to treating people with equity, with accountability, is very different. And so for all of those reasons, it's incredibly hard to find any study that really benchmarks any of the good, particularly performance of people in one or another. And I would even venture to say that there are really, it's very difficult to also do that with pay, and I'm sort of provoking the next discussion. There are all sorts of studies that come out saying, you know, public sector is more paid than the private sector, but we have to take into consideration a whole bunch of different aspects of what those composition factors look like, who are we actually comparing ourselves to, you know, does leadership in the public sector equal leadership in the private sector? Certainly, there's very different complications and challenges. So maybe that was a very long way of answering no.
Thank you.
I'm covering the position of Director for International Cooperation, or Deputy Minister. Talking about comparison, Mr. Daniel, you presented before this overview of the total share of employees in public sector against the total employment in the country. So I'm very familiar with your work, with work of OECD, because we are tackling now with the challenge of optimizing of the number of employees. That is one of our main goals of our strategy that we are implementing for the reform of public administration. I'm interested how should we, with whom should we compare ourselves? With the states, with other states with a similar number of population? But I also saw that there is a difference between the scope of central governance, of governance at all. For example, we do not count army in our governance and similar. So my question is, how do we determine the optimal number of the employees, let's say, per citizen? Is that even possible? Beside the number of, like, I know that we can do it for teachers, I know we can do it for doctors, but for the clerks, for the civil servants, it's really hard for us to determine the optimal number for it. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a very complex challenge, and it's one that those numbers that I started with really hide in many ways, because those were really looking globally at the entire public sector. So in those numbers, we include teachers, we include doctors, we include employees of state-owned enterprises, we include you know, everything from municipal to national, and those numbers aren't particularly helpful in really defining an optimal number. You can see that there are some very high-performing countries at both ends of the scales. So the question is, I think you need to take a more functional approach. So as you said, you can do it with doctors, you can do it with teachers. Maybe there's a way of doing it with administrators looking, I would suggest looking more internally for this and not necessarily looking externally. If you look at the outputs, at the performance, at the way that the administration runs, there's often questions that can be asked within particular administrations and also across organizations. So if you see that your Ministry of whatever employment has far more people with certain skill sets than your Ministry of, you know, X, Y, or Z, there could be interesting lessons to be learned by trying to develop the data within and looking at who seems to be doing things more efficiently and effectively. And also recognizing that sometimes optimization actually means increasing certain categories of employees while you're decreasing others. So it's a very big challenge, and it's one that I don't think can be easily addressed by a simple benchmarking exercise. I think there has to be, but benchmarking within governments can be a very strong tool as well, and one that perhaps is easier to develop within your own scope of influence.
Thank you. Пожалуйста, президент ААПа.
Thank you very much. Alex Brillantes from Asian Association of Public Administration. I'd like to take off from the presentation of Christine this morning when she talked about sometimes our DNA is not really to change, it's just really to be there. I mean, okay, there's the resistance to change. And listening to you, we all talk about the need to bring about change, disruptive, et cetera, et cetera. But my point is, through time, we've had so many studies. I mean, all of us here in public administration, I'm sure some of us have read Teaching the Elephant to Dance, Muddling Through, etc., etc. My question is, based on what you have done, is there a typical timeline, or how long will it take? Will it take one generation? And number two, in your second to the last slide, you talk about developing a performance culture. Question, how does one bring this about? Is it through leadership? Is it through extensive training? Is it through, well, later on we'll talk about pay, et cetera, et cetera. So to a certain extent, really, essentially, how long will this take, and are some more hopeful than others? Thank you.
You guys have really easy questions. Well, I think it's very hard to give a number or any kind of definitive answer to your first question, but I would certainly say that it's a sustained effort that is required. And part of the challenge of public employment, public sector, anything public sector, is that the public sector tends not to give enough time to any change. They tend to want to make an announcement quickly, a political announcement, and the follow-through is very rarely sustained and financed to a degree that allows for this change to really take hold. And this is the case in almost all of the countries that we've looked at. And this is due to all sorts of reasons which are part of the DNA of the public sector. It's due to the small amounts of money that are available to invest in these kinds of things. It's due to the nature of political cycles. So simply to say, what kind of timeline, I don't know. But the timing also really depends on the level of investment. But I can say that none of this will happen quickly with the development of something, and then, there's no, you develop a new performance framework, fine. You put it out there, great. But your job has only just begun. And that's often where people think that it's ended. What was your second question? Yeah, so again, I think you can follow through with that if you define a new performance system, that's not going to change a culture. It is the management, it's the leadership, and it's the ability to be able to understand and track performance. And so there we get into a whole question about what we're measuring. How do we measure outcomes? How do we make sure that we are working towards measurable outcomes that can be used both as a motivator and as a assessment tool? And I don't mean assessment in the terms of giving somebody a bad report. I mean it in terms of being able to understand where we're going and how to course correct. And those elements, all those elements are essential in a performance culture, probably even more so than any performance system in terms of, once a year check-ins and performance rankings.
Thank you. Please, Joseph, if you could briefly.
Well, I think maybe there was some favoritism here because Yernar knows me, so that's what we call petty corruption. Okay. Anyway, I'm a little hesitant to ask my question because I'm here on a temporary visa, and if you don't see me tomorrow, that means I was on the 4 a.m. flight to Istanbul on Turkish Airlines. Okay, so just to let you know, if you don't see me here tomorrow. Inspired by Christine's talk this morning, in terms of disruptive questions, and also the critical attitude that Sayasat had mentioned. So I will ask my question, but before my question, I want to make a confession, and the confession is the following, that I am probably an unreasonable person. And why is that? So if some of you may recall, Bernard Shaw said one time, he gave the definition between a reasonable person and an unreasonable person. So he said, a reasonable person will adapt himself to the reality. And an unreasonable person will want to change the reality. The conclusion is that all development really depends on unreasonable people. And I'm sure people that know me will attest to the fact that I'm an unreasonable person. Okay. I'm working in the Agency for Civil Service, and in my opinion, I will make a contrarian statement. And in my personal judgment, I think there is very little robust empirical evidence to suggest that increasing the quality of the civil service will lead to substantive decreases in the level of corruption in a country. Anyway, I've made my statement, so my question is that basically that there is no robust empirical evidence to suggest that improving the civil service will lead to a decrease in the level of corruption. Inshallah, I hope I see you tomorrow.
I think there might be actually some empirical evidence to that fact, but we can carry that conversation on later. We weren't looking at corruption specifically in this report, so I'll send you some of the documents that I have in mind, and we can carry that on offline.
Thank you. Two last questions, Panos and Dijan.
One of your slides, Daniel, you presented the different HRM management systems for the senior civil service. Does that include political appointees? Because otherwise I would question some of the statistics there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also a difficult question because political appointees have a very different concept, or there's a very different meaning or reality that's embodied by political appointees from one country to another. So in the US, for example, the US told us they're going to answer the section on senior civil servants for their senior executive service, not for their political appointees. That means that the data that we collected was really just for that core permanent SES position. But in other countries, the entire management is political appointees. And in that case, they did respond for political appointments. The way that we've tried to get around this is by creating sort of hierarchical structures and asking these questions based on the different hierarchical structures under the ministers, as opposed to asking them for political appointees or non. And so then we tried to really get at the function of the position regardless of whether it's a political position or not.
Dorian, пожалуйста. Последний вопрос.
Hi Daniel, thank you for your creative and structured presentation. My name is Dorian Obakirov. I'm receiving my master degree in project management at Boston University. So the question is, so there are some decisions that can be done in 1 minute, or some actions that can be done in 1 minute, but there are a lot of governments in the world that do it in 30 minutes, or like in 30 minutes, in 30 days, or in even 1 year. So what do you think, what we can do that this decision can be done in 1 minute, or even, for example, in 1 hour, or some actions? I have my own opinion. I will share with you if you want, but I would like to listen to you.
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite followed your question. You're asking about what kind of things can be done in a minute?
So there are some actions and decisions that can be done in 1 minute.
In terms of people management, you mean, or in general?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
And but governments in the world, they do these decisions and actions in 30 days, or even in 1 year. I mean, I talk about bureaucracy.
Okay. So you're asking
So
how
do you understand my question?
How can we improve the sort of on-the-spot decision-making capabilities of government officials?
How we can speed up the decision-making process and action process?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the answer might actually sort of be in your question already. You have to speed it up. You have to essentially empower people to make decisions at lower levels of the organizational structure, and that comes with a change in the values and the culture of an organization, from one that's based on regulation to one that's based on trust. Now, the regulation culture, people can work very quickly with some decisions if it's very clear in the regulations what those decisions can be, and they can apply very quickly a structured process to it. But and sometimes just clarifying regulation and clarifying those issues can help to speed up things and can help. But generally, we're working in much more complex environments than that. And we've done some interesting work with countries like Chile and Brazil, which are looking at public sector innovation. And part of the challenge they have is that in the public sectors in those countries, you can only do what the law tells you can do. You can't do anything unless the law tells you you can do it. Where, of course, in the private sector, you can do anything as long as the law tells you that doesn't tell you that you can't, right? Innovation in those kinds of contexts is very challenging, and giving people the leeway, the space to be able to make decisions, to try new things, to make judgments is very challenging. And so there needs to be a careful rebalancing or a careful thinking about this balance between regulation on the one hand and people's individual competence and trust on the other. In many cases, the frontline service delivery staff in governments are being reduced in terms of the pay that they're given and the grades that they're assigned. So they're getting very low-level people to do these jobs who don't have much authority to make decisions. This very much slows down these kinds of decision-making processes, because you'll have somebody coming up to them with a very complex challenge on their hands saying, you know, I don't understand why I received a different kind of benefit than the one I should have received, and you know, here's my situation, I fall into this category, but I'm also part of this, and I'm also part of this. And they'll have to sort of, you know, work up a very slow process to get this case looked at. In many cases, this is unfortunate. In countries where there's more qualified people working on the front lines, you see these kinds of dilemmas being resolved in real time and creating a much better service experience for the customers.
Thank you very much.
Уважаемые коллеги, я хотел бы подытожить. На самом деле у нас уже время подходит к концу. Нас ждет coffee break, после которого у нас вторая сессия по компенсации, по оплате труда государственных служащих. В целом, Даниэл, вы говорили особенно про концепции именно различий между позиционной и карьерной моделью, которые не только интересны для Казахстана, но для всех стран, которые участвуют в региональном хабе. Вот недавно лично был в Ташкенте, сейчас там очень большая реформа проводится в сфере государственного управления, государственной службы, новый закон о госслужбе Ташкента, там они провозглашают более смешанные позиционно-карьерные модели. Вы также сказали поэтому стандарт ОСР, мне кажется, будет интересно тоже обсудить и в рамках нашего coffee break, в рамках нашего ужина. Вы также сказали про OECD Public Service Leadership and Capability Facility, который было бы интересно от вас также услышать в последующих сессиях. Как вы видите этот инструмент использовать, как можно будет этот инструмент использовать в партнерстве с Агентством по делам государственной службы Казахстана и с другими уполномоченными органами стран-участниц хаба. На правах модератора я бы хотел также предоставить слово нескольким нашим партнерам, участникам Астанинского хаба, которые не смогли предложить свои комментарии. Это Нармин Зейналова с Азербайджана, Межения Наталья с Российской академией госслужбы, Ираклий Катышвили и Алмазбек. Поэтому хотел бы их пригласить. Нармин, я, кстати, ее не видел. Вкратце, если пару минут, пожалуйста, Нармин. Вы можете сюда подойти. Рад вас здесь видеть. Пару минут, пожалуйста.
First of all, I would like to thank all of you for invitation to this event. It was very interesting to hear the presentations about the system, public service system. Also, in Azerbaijan, we have reforms recently. It's already 2 years we are conducting these reforms in the optimization of the civil service and public administration. And maybe most of you already know that regarding this, in accordance with these public administration reforms, the Civil Service Commission under the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan was like dissolved, and now state examination center was created, established, and it's not only conducting the recruitment to civil service, but also admission to the different levels of education. And now the priority of in the public administration system of Azerbaijan, we are preparing the civil service strategy for 2018 and 2025, which covers different issues. Also, we are now shifting from the knowledge-based recruitment to the competency-based recruitment. So it's very urgent and very important issues nowadays in our system. And also we have twinning project we are conducting. You are saying about the motivation of civil servants, which is very interesting for us also, because we just now working in this system, and we want to compare the private and public sector salary system, remuneration system of civil servants, and that's why it's very important to see the presentations after the break also. So I would like to thank you again. So any questions, or you are welcome to ask. Please.
May I make
Yes, yes.
make an additional comment, if you don't mind? As people know, I am quite against borrowing best practices. I think that it is, when I look at Estonia, with no disrespect to Christine, I've never been there, so I'm totally ignorant about Estonia, totally ignorant. But I believe the population is 1.3 million, you said, and probably a small-sized country. So in best practices, I think that the experience of Estonia should be applicable to similarly small-sized countries and small populations. For example, perhaps the experience of Estonia is relevant for maybe Astana. I'm not so sure it's relevant for Karachi, just to make a point. And in fact, it might be relevant for Karachi. I'm not sure it's relevant for Nigeria as a country. So I have a basic problem with this whole notion of best practices. It's very, I think it's pushed by the OECD sometimes, maybe pushed by UN. I'm making these accusations without much evidence, so I will, I may retract them if I am wrong. The problem, actually, the problem is even deeper. Actually, the problem is something that I learned from Professor Colin Knox here. It's called the phenomenon of isomorphic mimicry. It's a very technical term. It's called isomorphic mimicry. I'm just afraid that there's a danger of too much. I mean, if you borrow too many practices from the OECD countries, that what you have is isomorphic mimicry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's more of a general comment than to Narmin, I guess. So let me address that. Narmin, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe. I think that's a good point that you mentioned, because that's exactly why the Astana Civil Service Hub exists, to really facilitate peer-to-peer learning and really learn not only from the international best practices, but also from good practices. Пожалуйста, Наталья.
Уважаемый Алихан Мухамедович, уважаемый модератор, дамы и господа, позвольте поприветствовать вас от лица Российской академии народного хозяйства и государственной службы при президенте Российской Федерации и ее самого крупного регионального кампуса Северо-Западного института управления в Санкт-Петербурге. Наш вуз является самым большим вузом нашей большой страны, ключевой функцией которого является как раз-таки обучение и подготовка тех самых управленцев, менеджеров для всех сфер и уровней государственной и муниципальной службы, бюджетных организаций и бизнеса. Во всей системе президентской академии обучается около 200 тысяч студентов и служащих. В Северо-Западном институте управления обучается 20 тысяч студентов и служащих. Наш слоган «Наши выпускники управляют страной». И то есть почему мне захотелось как раз выступить, и очень удачно, спасибо за то, что дали слово, выступить после вот такой прекрасной презентации, которая говорит о том, как нужно готовить и кого нужно готовить для государственной службы будущего. То есть мы как раз стараемся готовить тех самых профессиональных и эффективных лидеров со стратегическим видением, инновационными подходами, которые готовы к изменениям. То есть развитие лидерства, то, о чем говорил господин Дэниел Герсон, это наша первостепенная задача в обучении. И поэтому спасибо огромное за эту презентацию, она была очень полезна и интересна. То есть для нас большая честь, конечно же, сегодня находиться здесь и иметь возможность ознакомиться с тем самым передовым опытом 40 стран, участниц регионального хаба. И мы уверены, что в условиях эпохи цели устойчивого развития особое внимание должно уделяться новым методам обучения и подготовки, переподготовки, повышения квалификации новых управленцев, менеджеров и взаимодействию вузов с такими практическими мультидисциплинарными организациями, международными организациями, каким является региональный хаб в сфере государственного управления. Мы являемся не просто вузом, но в то же время научно-прикладным, экспертным и консалтинговым центром, признанным федеральной инновационной площадкой Российской Федерации. И поэтому хотела бы выразить здесь готовность включиться в научную, экспертную работу хаба в таких направлениях, как вот я изучила внимательно, сегодня прослушала оценку и обзор тех тематик, которые представляют интерес для развития научных исследований в будущем. Это, конечно же, стратегирование, развитие стратегического мышления, стратегического планирования. Это государство как платформа, развитие нового видения государства. Это оценка эффективности государственных служащих и бенчмаркинг. Поэтому полагаю, что вот как раз в этом взаимодействии вузов и таких крупнейших международных организаций и в таком инновационном обучении и есть залог успеха молодых управленцев нашего совместного будущего, то есть того человеческого потенциала, о котором вот мы говорили на этой сессии и будем продолжать говорить сегодня и завтра. И, конечно же, пользуясь случаем, пользуясь этой возможностью, позвольте поздравить региональный хаб в сфере государственного управления и лично руководителя хаба с его 5-летним юбилеем, пожелать долгого развития, успешного развития и вручить Алихану Мухамедовичу поздравительный адрес от руководителя Северо-Западного института управления Шамаха Владимира Александровича и небольшой сувенир памятный.
Наталья, спасибо. Пожалуйста, Ираклий Кадатишвили, UNDP Regional Center.
Dear Mr. Baymanov, Excellencies, dear participants, colleagues at the Astana Civil Service Hub, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub, let me warmly congratulate you with the 5th year anniversary of this very important organization. 5 years passed since the establishment of the hub, and these 5 years has proved already that the hub, with already more than 40 participant countries from around the world, not only from the Central Asian region but also from around the world, is becoming an important player in the region and beyond when it comes to innovations and cutting-edge research on many important topics on public administration and especially on SDGs, which are not exclusive ownership of the UN system, but it should be also the part of our daily agenda. Let me give a very brief overview of UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub, which was established in 2013. We cover Europe and Central Asia, 18 countries and 1 territory. We manage 137 global, regional and country level projects with annual portfolio of more than $89 million. During the last 4 years, we received over 900 service requests from our country offices. Now let me very briefly touch upon our future common plans, as we discussed with Mr. Baymenov today. The work around innovation labs, which UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub is famous for in the region. We already have experience in Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, Serbia, and other countries. So this is the area where we see a potential for cooperation with Astana Civil Service Hub and piloting the innovation lab in Kazakhstan and maybe in other participant countries of Astana Civil Service Hub. Another very important area we think is its upcoming global summit of open government partnership in Tbilisi, Georgia, in July this year, and we hope that with the leadership of Astana Civil Service Hub, the Central Asian countries will be able to participate in this summit. The next, and we are already in touch with our colleagues at Astana Civil Service Hub, is about the Innovation Solution Scheme, and we are very much proud to be part of this selection commission. And the next is about the course on SDGs for public servants, how we can educate better our public servants on the role of SDGs and implementation in our daily activities. In closing, let me thank you again for the opportunity to address this very honorable audience and congratulate you again with this quite significant milestone, and reassure you that the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub stands ready to continue and deepen our cooperation in the future. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Irakli. Сейчас я хотел бы передать слово Алмазбеку Насырову, ректору Академии госуправления при президенте Республики Кыргызстан. Комментариев, пожалуйста, пару минут.
Your Excellencies, Excellency Dr. Baymenov, I'd like to seize this opportunity and express my deepest gratitude for giving me the opportunity to be here and sharing my experience and expertise about our successful and fruitful cooperation within the last 3 days since that time when Academy of Public Administration under the President of the Kyrgyz Republic became as a team, as a member of great team of Astana Civil Servants Hub. Nowadays, we have good evidence that within the last 5 years, we have very sustainable and successful platform on discussion and dialogue regarding civil service reform, capacity building for human resources for whole of our countries who are member of its serious platform for promoting of all best practices and experience around not only in the regional format but only in the global format. Since last 3 years, when we became a member of Astana Regional Hub, we implement several international events regarding, first of all, for improving of the reform of civil service in our countries, improving the system of capacity building, which means that not only training capacity building, as well training needs assessment, capacity building and invention of some new mechanisms how to make the best work, especially in the field of setting up of the leadership in the good governance. Hopefully, this is just the start of our activity, and in the future, we will move towards the global linking between our countries. At the moment, over than 40 countries are members of regional hub, but nowadays we know that hub is playing a vital role in modern reforming system of the civil service. Why? Because hub providing good networking between West and East, and between Europe, Asia, and America. And today, we are working not only as an experts, but also we are working as an ambassador of peace and best wishes of our countries. And I think all members of our great team are quite happy to be here and to share their experience, which make possible to make great input how to move humanity and the people towards well-being around the world. And now, due to crucial changes in the geopolitical world, in economy, and now we are facing with very fast technological revolution as well, it generates a lot of possibilities to think and generate new indicators for improving of the quality of decision-making system around the world. And so, Astana Hub's platform, I think today it's a unique platform where we can openly discuss and express our attitudes and wishes for the future, and hope in 5 or 6 years our vision will be changed extremely, and we will work on how to make input for the human well-being at all, and probably in strategic view we can indicate that public management system will be similar for all countries within the frame of all around the world accepted integration unions and integration societies. I'd like to seize this opportunity, dear members, dear colleagues, and especially I'd like to express my deepest gratitude for Astana Regional Hub team, who are definitely making great job, and personally to Dr. Baymenov, Alihan Muhamedovich, and I'd like to express one more that Dr. Baymenov, our professor, honorary professor of the Academy of Public Administration, and within the last 3-4 days he made a lot of initiatives, very useful and popular in the Kyrgyz Republic, and in the future I strongly believe that our cooperation will become more wider and more effectively for the needs of all our countries who are the membering in its organization. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. On this partnership note, I would like to close the session, and would like to offer the coffee break for 15 minutes if we can come back for the also a very exciting session on public service motivation and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We have very interesting 2 speakers who will be talking about salary scheme in global trends, but also the US federal salary scheme. So we're looking forward to having you back in 15 minutes, probably by 4:10. Thank you.